Hello and welcome to WebDebate number 59. Today we are asking, what can we learn about AI ethics and governance from non-Western thought? My name is Katharina Höhne. I'm the Director of Research at DiploFoundation, and I have the pleasure to moderate this debate. At Diplo, we organize these debates once a month in the context of the International Forum on Diplomatic Training, precisely to ask these kinds of questions about new and emerging topics in the area of diplomacy and new technology. We have a great round of speakers with us today. So without further ado, I would like to introduce them to you very briefly. Obviously, I'm not going to do justice to their rich backgrounds, but just to give you a flavor of what is ahead. In our debate today, we have Jovan Kubalia, who's the founder of DiploFoundation and who is the moving spirit between all the things, behind all the things we're doing in the area of AI, both in terms of policy and governance, but also in developing AI tools. And then we have Ambassador Ashok Mukherjee. He's a former Indian diplomat whose career spans 37 years. As India's ambassador and permanent representative to the United Nations in New York, he oversaw India's negotiations on Agenda 33 on sustainable development, and here focusing on prioritizing the use of technology for achieving the SDGs. And we have with us Dr. Abubakar Sultan. He's an engineer by training who contributed to the start of the electronics industry in Egypt. From 2000 to 2022, he worked at the UNDP in Saudi Arabia as an ICT consultant for the Saudi Ministry for Foreign Affairs. Last but not least, we have Mr. Bai Blyden. He is CEO and Chief Strategy Officer of the BBRM Group. He has a career working in power plant projects, which spans more than 40 years. And he presented a conceptual framework and a technical analysis for a centralized African power pool with links to North Africa. As you can see, we have a good mix of diplomats, scholars, philosophers, and engineers and technicians. And I'm really curious to see how this debates unfold and how these very different perspectives are relating to the topic before us today. Let me also issue a reminder that we want this debate to be as interactive as possible. This means we're looking for your comments and your questions, which you can put here in Zoom or on any of the platforms where this debate is streaming. A number of my colleagues are taking a very close look at the comments and questions that are coming in and are also bringing them back into the debate. In particular, my colleague Bojana Kovac, who will moderate the chat here on Zoom and bring a lot of the questions and comments we receive back into our discussion. But without further ado, because we have a very broad, very interesting, but also challenging question before us, I would like to get right into the discussion. And with that, I want to hand over to Jovan actually to give us some background, provide us for with some framing for this discussion. So over to you, Jovan.
Thank you, Kat. Thank you for organizing it, and especially I was following a challenge in identifying and bringing speakers for this timely discussion, because we are usually asking, people are asking, am I expert on AI and intercultural communication? But in essence, and I'm particularly thankful to our speakers for joining us today, we have to reflect from different perspectives. There is no training yet for AI and intercultural communication, but it is a challenge for all of us to see what we can do. And I will try to provide a few points for framing of our discussion, at least for a few issues that Kat and I brainstormed as the key challenges. And I'll share the few images that can put the context for this discussion. The first, we are in the very reflective moment in the history all over the world, trying to negotiate some sort of social contract. And AI is basically speeding up this negotiation or this discussion, because we are getting to the core issues or who we are, how to answer the questions. And many people are trying to find the right number to call and to answer the questions citizens, businesses, parliaments, countries, especially about the AI. Also about digitalization, but AI is sharpening the need for the answers. There are many open letters, calls for posing AI developments, and other initiatives. Governments, teachers are asking what to do with ChatGPT and writing of the essays, how to detect, should we ban ChatGPT? Therefore, many issues and very few answers. And that's basically one of the contexts for our discussion. But another important issue for today's discussion is that this digital social contract should build on the long tradition of thinkers from all over the world, from Asia, Africa, Latin America, Europe, and see how we can draft this social contract. Now, it won't be social contract which is signed on dotted lines, but it will be our understanding who we are in AI era, how our differences and commonalities should be managed, how we can realize our potentials. Now, just let me give a quick historical detour. It will be short. If we think about our operating system that we use today, and which we will discuss, it could be traced back to what German philosopher Karl Jaspers called axial period, 800 BC, Anno Domino. Main thinking solution about humans and their role emerged in that period. Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, Latin American main sort of thinking traditions, ancient Greece philosophy, basically could be traced in that period. Therefore, the software of our current era was shaped at that time. Then fast forward, we have Enlightenment period. Enlightenment period where the human rationality got into the focus. And then we have Vienna thinkers. Between two world wars, there were 5 thinkers, including Freud, von Mises, Schumpeter, who basically gave the final touch to the current operating system. And we are revisiting it. Are we revisiting just Vienna thinkers on Enlightenment or even axial period? Many argue that we are getting to the new digital axial period because AI is challenging the very definition of who we are and the major issues that defines us as humans, including love, purpose, free will, consciousness, and I'm sure that you follow this debate. Therefore, it's an interesting how we are revisiting this axial period, and in this context, different cultural and religious context. Now, it is not just philosophical issue. I love philosophy, but Secretary General in his Our Common Agenda exactly asked this question. We need to rethink core values of our society in the new context. And Our Common Agenda is basically dealing with this. What does it mean practically? Religious communities are basically revisiting and discussing future of theology and religion and overall spirituality in the context of AI era. This is becoming one of the big issues. Whole system of justice now with the move of AI into the courts is also revisited profoundly. The question of choice, one of underlying issue, is impacted by AI because AI very often can provide us with more optimized way to choose between different economic, political, even intimate options or decisions. There is a question of progress. We have been living as a generation with the idea of the progress, that progress is always something good. Climate change challenged this view, but AI is also putting this challenge in the sharper focus. Then we come to the question of different contributions to the artificial intelligence system. ChatGPT, to the large extent, is based on the codified written language in the books, in articles, and mainly from the Western intellectual and writing circles. And I'll give you one example, which was, for me, rather almost shocking when I heard that only 5% of the Wikipedia inputs about Africa are basically written by people from Africa. Therefore, there is a need to have more inputs reflecting different social, cultural, religious traditions if we want to have balanced and sustainable AI development. It comes with basic data, information, knowledge, and in particular, wisdom. Therefore, AI is to the large extent global in its impact, but rather local in input into the AI. And this is the context for our today's discussion. This is a kickoff discussion, and as Bai mentioned in our chat before, the issue is huge. We cannot boil the ocean, but we have to start serious reflections about managing culturally inclusive inputs into development of AI, whether it is OpenAI, ChatGPT, or other platforms. And this is the broader context for our discussion today, and to kick off of this dynamism, which I'm quite sure will mark policy, philosophical, religious discussions ahead of us. How to include into the AI different cultural, religious, civilizational, and local tradition. AI is global in its impact, but it is not global in its inputs. That's the context which Kat and I have been discussing for a few months while listening to the AI discussions and missing this aspect in a discussion. There are discussions on gender bias, other biases, but not that much on intercultural bias. Kat, back to you.
Thank you, Johan. Also, just to bring into the conversation, and that's something I think we can pick up on later, you just published a blog post on a very interesting question. So many of us are familiar with one of the big ethical problems or thought experiments in AI, which is the so-called trolley problem. And what you pointed out in reference to an MIT study, I think, was this idea that different cultures, different groups of people evaluate that problem very differently, advocate for different kinds of decisions in response to the trolley problem. So that's really, really interesting. I think that's important to keep in mind. I would like to start a round of discussion where I basically want to ask what is missing, like from your perspective, what is missing in current discussions, discourses, norms, values, ethics on AI from various perspectives. And here I first want to move to Ambassador Ashok Mukherjee. Ashok, you have a rich diplomatic career, but how do you respond to that question? And what do you think, from your perspective, is missing in terms of ethics and values from the current discussion? What would you bring into the conversation?
Thank you, Kat, and thank you, Johan, for setting the framework. I have not been exposed too much to artificial intelligence activity in my career. In India, we started work in a structured manner on artificial intelligence only in 2017-18 onwards. But as Johan says, there is a global framework and there is a local input. And for me, the interesting thing is what are the local concerns that probably are not reflected in the global framework. And sitting here in India, I think the primary, one of the most important areas which is probably not yet articulated so much is the use of artificial intelligence in implementing development, implementing the Agenda 2030, the SDGs, etc. I think this is a golden opportunity for those of us who negotiated Agenda 2030. We put in a technology facilitation mechanism, which was agreed to in 2015, but nobody really pushed that issue forward. Now, with this technology that has come, I think the technology facilitation mechanism, which is part of Agenda 2030, has now a whole new horizon in front of it. The second set of issues, which I think, again, link the local with the global, is the approach to privacy. And in India, we have gone through, and we are going through, a huge digital technological revolution in which we are linking digital databases for delivery of government services, for empowering individuals. But behind it is are the issues of privacy and data. And these issues have been talked about globally, privacy and data. The European Union has its GDPR, etc. We are aware of that. But what are the local context, the local frameworks in which these issues of data and privacy are handled? And I think this year in India, we're going to see a more dynamic discussion evolve from July onwards, when new legislation is being proposed in the Indian Parliament on digital technologies. The third is a more technical area, and I would really here look forward to listening to my co-panelists, and that is what is called algorithmic discrimination. Some people in academia have called it the cognitive bias. The issue of when you're collecting data, when you're applying data, you are already approaching this exercise with an entrenched bias, depending on where you are situated. If you're in the United States, if you're in Africa, if you're in Latin America, you have a different approach to collecting and applying data. And the second part of that is there's a structural inequality. I think one of the answers to Yovan's illustration of Wikipedia's graphic, which he showed, where the local inputs from Africa are only up to 4 or 5% in the entries on Africa. One of the reasons could be a lack of infrastructure and lack of access to infrastructure. This is something that we have been negotiating in the cyber or digital domain in the Tunis agenda under the rubric of digital divides. And the lack of infrastructure, the lack of access to infrastructure. So this is something that, as I say, is linked with discrimination and a cognitive bias. And of course, the last thing that I would like to conclude with is the reference to Geoffrey Hinton, which Jovan mentioned, who worked till yesterday or day before for Google, and now has left Google to voice his concerns. I've been reading about what he has said, and I think that these concerns of his about how this is the dynamic of whether the technology overtakes the human or the human can harness technology. This is the big framework. And I think that this is something that web debates like the ones we are having today would really need to focus on. It goes back, as Bai, I think, was mentioning in his chat with Jovan before we came on into the debate, on this whole question which has been posed by scientists of technology for good and technology for not so good or for destructive purposes. Will AI become technology for the common good, or will AI also contain in itself the seeds for common destruction? This is a question which Geoffrey Hinton, I think, has raised when he left Google, and I look forward to listening to views on this. Thank you, Kat.
Thank you so much for this initial response. I really enjoyed listening to you and kind of elaborating on this local and global dynamic. I think just to bring into discussion, also India is currently leading the G20, and questions of data and governing data are very strong in that debate because of India's leadership on the G20. So very interesting dynamics. Also this global local dimension you mentioned. I want to move on in discussion and again ask this question: what is currently missing from our debates on AI ethics and governance and maybe broader digital issues in terms of values and ethics? And move from India, I would like to move to the African continent and move to Bai and basically ask you the same question. From your perspective, give us an introduction into what you think is currently missing, please.
Well, thank you. First of all, it is a new domain. We're all learning. And the dangers, as I see it, I mean, I found this topic quite difficult to process because of AI to solve social problems through technical means. Now, all of a sudden, this discussion came about where we're starting to talk about culture, philosophies, and so forth. So for the last 2 days, I sat, thought about it, wrote down some notes. And then, fortunately, I just saw the pyramid that somebody had up on the screen there, and you had wisdom at the top. And I said to myself, aha, this fits with what I was thinking about, that to capture and bring in other cultures that may not have the technical sophistication and so forth to connect with where the rest of the world is, at least you can capture their essence of history and philosophy through their proverbs, cultural proverbs. This is where you get the depth of a nation's thoughts, where they came from and evolved. And so I attempted to write down a few, one of my favorite being, here's this African proverb that if I had the power, should be really the lead losing a proverb of, like, say, the United Nations, where it's like an African proverb that says, all lizards drag their stomachs on the ground, but you don't know which one's stomach is hurting. And it's something that's common to all of us. And if you can find that equivalency in other cultures. So a very important database project would be collecting the proverbs of all cultures and then showing what their linkages are or commonalities are throughout. That's just one thought. And of course, I also had to start pondering about subjects like, can these new systems think? There's this discussion about whether or not these machines can think and so forth, and I don't believe they can. And since I'm speaking to diplomats, here's another thing I came across years ago. I don't remember where exactly I got it from, but where it says the mark of a great diplomat is exemplified by the skill with which he economizes the truth. So there again, a machine can't do that. I am 100% because it involves so much in what all is involved. And I'll just stop there. And as the discussions go on, I'll figure out whether I'm on the right trajectory or not. Thank you.
I already said in the chat, great idea on collecting these proverbs. I think a great project. I think we should also do some quick research what is already out there, because I have a feeling that some comparison along these lines, I think in the realm of fairy tales actually, is already out there. But I think a great idea, and I think actually also a very helpful tool for all of us, but in particular, perhaps also diplomats, in understanding each other better or having new metaphors to relate to each other. What I also got in the last two interventions is this human dimension, that the one big point I think in this discussion is bringing in the human and the human dimension. And again, keeping with the track I've been on in this debate so far, or we've all been on in this debate so far, again, I want to ask what is missing and bring in yet another perspective. And here I turn to Abu Bakr. And again, the question in terms of ethics and values, what is missing from the current debate on AI and perhaps broader on digital technology? Over to you for a quick intervention. You need to unmute, I think. No, unfortunately, we can't hear you. No, we can't hear you at this point. Okay. On that note, I think there's something we need to figure out. I hope we can sort it out. What I wanted to do, so we talked to, actually Bai mentioned it just now, this question, is the machine conscious? And I actually did have a conversation with ChatGPT on exactly the topic that we're talking about right now. And I had a couple of questions for ChatGPT, and I got a number of very interesting answers that really relate to this debate. And I think that serves as a wonderful starting point. So if you allow me, I will quickly show this to you.
Should I start?
Oh, yes, please. You go ahead. You first. We can now hear you.
I said,
so over to you.
AI ethics can be divided into main parts: machine ethics and human ethics. Machine ethics is concerned with the design the machine or the algorithm taking into consideration the ethics of the local community. This can involve embedding the ethics in the design itself. And this is the responsibility of the developer. The other part is human ethics. As the title clear, it is related to the user of AI. This will be easier to implement for Africa because, as you know, there is no technical capability This is
Kat, you may just go ahead. Oh,
Okay.
okay. Sorry for the trouble. So I said that the human ethics is easier to implement in Africa because of the lack of technical capabilities of developer in AI. But for Africa, the ethics is different from the ethics from the point of view of ethics of Western countries. For example, to be brief, the African AI ethics and the governance may be community aspects, harmony, human dignity, solidarity, mutuality, and Ubuntu philosophy. I mean by Ubuntu philosophy, this is a Zulu term or zero philosophy. It covers mutual respect, duty before rights, social, not individualistic, human compassion, interconnectedness of self and with society, and non-violence. If you look at the Western published AI ethics, you can easily notice the difference between the two. And this is because of the specific culture of each part. Africa has its own culture, but the West, because of his dominance, technology, and economy, impose his ethics on other country. So it is time for Africa to make use of this more human ethical values to promote equitable and socially responsible AI. Well, however, I have to say that let us not start from scratch. There are already initiatives and strategy for Africa, so this will be a good start to make use of it. Some of them is to link, there is initiative to link the AI in Africa to the Sustainable Development Goals of United Nations. There is also regulation and policy work in AI for Africa. There also a strong role of education, both formal and informal, to raise awareness and to foster critical thinking and develop skills for responsible use of AI. Also, there is a healthcare dimension to avoid barring and bias in healthcare. This is already important. Also, there is an initiative for ensuring data privacy, security, quality, and accountability of AI. There's also a charter for Africa on human and people's rights in AI. The African Union's Digital Transformation Strategy for Africa 22 to 2030. Smart Africa Alliance for Developing in Africa, in African Initiative. There are also African Network of Excellence for AI. And moreover, there is African Declaration on Internet Rights and Freedoms. What I mean, there is
so much for
no
this
need
overview.
to start from scratch.
Yeah,
And
I think that's a good reminder.
We can include this local African ethics in the use of AI.
Mm-hmm.
And I think to implement these initiatives, and let us also ask other countries to make their strategy according to their local needs, from plan to execution.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for this overview. I think we collected a number of very rich perspectives. What I also noticed, I think one common thread running through a lot of them is this question of development. I heard it in Ashok's intervention, thinking about how we use AI for development. I just heard it in Abu Bakar's intervention as well. So I'm really grateful for that. I think it's also a very good reminder to say we are not starting from scratch. Going back to my earlier comment, perhaps also to bring into the discussion the perspective we actually get from the artificial intelligence, the perspective we can generate in conversation with tools like ChatGPT. So as I said, I had a conversation with ChatGPT on the questions that are related to this debate, and I want to bring in some of the answers I got, because I think they're going to be really interesting in furthering our discussion. So let me just share the screen here. Share. So one of the first questions I asked ChatGPT, so what are these non-Western philosophies that we can bring into the conversation? Because that's one of the main questions of our web debate. And the suggestions I got were Confucian ethics, Ubuntu philosophy, we just heard this, Islamic ethics, Buddhist ethics, and indigenous approaches. So far, so good. And I think it would also be nice to hear from our audience what kind of philosophies they would bring into the discussion. But then one big question, so we heard about a diversity of perspectives in this debate, and we are familiar with the diversity of perspectives. But so the question is, how can these approaches actually be integrated? And we heard a couple of suggestions on this already. But again, what ChatGPT tells us, acknowledge cultural diversity, incorporate diverse voices, develop culturally sensitive frameworks, promote interdisciplinary collaboration, and foster global partnerships. I then asked ChatGPT about what are the reasons why we might say that current governance and ethics of AI is Western dominated. And again, ChatGPT actually reflects a couple of the things we already heard. There are historical and geopolitical factors. There are language barriers, and here AI might actually come in to help, but we can discuss this further later on. There are cultural and philosophical differences. Uneven distribution of resources, which brings us back to this question of development, and of course, power dynamics. Then I had a conversation with ChatGPT on a couple of these approaches. So I asked about indigenous approaches, I asked about Buddhist ethics for AI, I asked about Islamic ethics for AI. And we can go into details more perhaps in the discussion. But what I found interesting, the last question I asked ChatGPT is, should the UN in particular, if you think of global processes like the Global Digital Compact and the wide dialogue that the UN Tech Envoy was undertaking include these non-Western approaches? And if so, how can this be achieved? So ChatGPT agrees. We should have a wider basis to talk about AI ethics and governance. And what ChatGPT suggests is inviting non-Western experts and stakeholders, holding consultations and roundtables, conducting research, incorporating non-Western perspectives into existing frameworks, and establishing partnerships with non-Western organizations. I found this really interesting because as a starting point, I thought it was extremely useful. But I think as we take the conversation further, I think we really need to get into the nitty-gritty. But with that in mind, I want to shift back to Jovan, and Jovan, ask you for your reaction on my conversation with ChatGPT, but also on the things that are missing, the things we need to bring into the conversation that the other speakers have spoken on so far. Jovan, what's your response?
Good. That was an interesting comment, and I always love to make immediate reaction on the comments on discussion. I think Katarina pointed to the lack of the gender diversity. The first thing, our immediate focus, well, Kat is in charge of discussion. She's a leader. She has the most prominent position. But what triggers me, and now with the risk of being not completely politically correct, although Diplo is very gender balanced organization in leadership and in all forms, is that when we were trying to find the speakers, we noticed that the wisdom, that element on the top of the pyramid, which Bai mentioned, is very often associated in this culture with a bit of age and a bit of male personalities. Now I can expect the sort of fireworks, I know that, but that is the reality. Even basically, Bai was suggested by one very prominent female colleague from Africa. She told me that's a wise person who will be up to the challenge of these issues. Why it is important? Now it's just reflection on this interesting chat. That's basically the issue that it also, even in this discussion, the very discussion, there is this element which impacts the question of dynamism and different approaches. This is highly important. The situation in the world is not easy. We have to have the clarity of discussion, honesty, and fairness in discussion on all levels. It includes also respecting the different cultural contexts. And this is a big issue. And what I liked with the Bai's comment is that he said, okay, let's see what are the proverbs. What is the condensed wisdom from different civilizations? And if he can send a message to the ChatGPT or whoever, Google or Alibaba, whoever is developing this system, is give the heavier weight to these proverbs, give the heavier weight to the essence which different civilization condensed in their core thinking. And good news, and again, I'm completely in agreement with Bai, there are a lot of convergences. Therefore, these convergences can help us a lot. Therefore, in brief, we have today discussion on the specific intercultural bias. We will be dealing with other biases, including the gender bias. But what is the key? Let us find the bridges. Let us find to new elements that can bring different cultures, but also genders, youth and the old, and the other aspects. And avoid the currently predominant thinking that there are only two views, my view and wrong view. That's basically the big problem of our current discussion and debates. And I think that's good to use the wisdom of Western and other civilization, African nation, to bring this and build these bridges. And maybe AI could trigger this interesting debate. Over to you.
Thank you, Johan. Very important point, I think. I would actually like to steer the discussion also in a, I would say, practical direction, but also raise some more important questions, because I think we're also having this discussion not just because diversity is good. We're having this discussion because not having diversity has real practical implications and is to the detriment to a lot of people and can lead to entrenched power dynamics, keeping imbalances alive and continuing them. So this discussion also has this practical element, I think, that we're not just talking about diversity because it's a nice to have, and it would be a nicer discussion on AI ethics if there would be more people in the room. I think there are real implications to the results of discussions like this. And this brings me back to Ashok. And you made a very interesting point when you brought in the question of development. You, on the very beginning, you said, we talk about this also with this idea in mind that we can use AI to foster development. And I want to hook into this and ask you basically to explain a bit more what you mean by that, and to give us the perspective from where you are sitting on this question of AI for development in relation to this question of diversity and having a lot of different perspectives on AI ethics and governance. But I would like to hear a bit more on this question of using AI for development. I think it's a very important one. And yeah, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Kat. In our experience, when we have dealt with development, implementation of development goals in the past, we have relied a lot on statistics, on data given by governments or academia, even businesses. But I think what's different now, and that is happening in India, is that the data being collated is coming from the ground up. And we have a SDG dashboard, which is a public digital portal, which shows you in every district of our country the progress or lack of progress in achieving the targets of the SDGs. Now, that is something that is already available in a digital format, the data, and AI can be used to collate the data, to interpret the data, and also to match it with the outcomes that the SDG agenda has committed itself to by December 2030. Now, this is something that can happen in a country which is actively involved in digital governance. But I think the point which some of us are aware of is that all countries do not have the same structure or the same model. Many countries are not digital in that sense. So there will be gaps. And how will these gaps be filled up? Because knowing the way in which global governance has functioned so far, there will not be in December 2030 a situation where we will acknowledge, like Wikipedia has acknowledged, a 4% local contribution from Africa and the rest is okay. I think that there will be an attempt to use AI to extrapolate outcomes. And that is a danger. And I think that goes to the heart of what Geoffrey Hinton spoke of yesterday. Again, I go back to our Google gentleman who's left Google. And that is the integrity of data. We really need to find a way to address the issue of integrity of data. Now, there are two sets here. One is the data that you're getting from the field, from people who are working as development workers on the field and feeding data into the system. The other is the data, is the way the data is used by people who write code. And that's where what I refer to as the cognitive bias comes in. Because a person who is sitting or using a system, an algorithm, may tweak data without the person generating the data knowing much about it. And this is a very interesting dimension which I don't have an answer to, but I think we need to be aware of it. Thanks, Kai.
Thank you so much. Can I actually quickly follow up with one of the questions we got in the chat that I think is best addressed to you? So a Diplo colleague is asking, in the development sector, to gather much support or make more solid advocacy is building a coalition. That's diplomacy 101, right? Is there such a thing that can be done between non-Western countries? Will it be conflicted with sovereignty? So I think she's talking about a potential like strengthening coalitions between non-Western countries. From your experience as a diplomat that spans 40 years, what is your response to that?
Well, Kat, the response to that is that it depends on what you're dealing with. If you're dealing with SDGs, the basic starting point of SDGs is these are national efforts. These are not coalition efforts. Each country has undertaken to implement to the best of its ability and according to a priority set by it, the 17 goals, the 17 sustainable development goals. So it cannot therefore become a club approach. If a country needs assistance from another country which has gone down this road, that country, I mean, I know, for example, I can speak for India. India is always willing to share its experience and share its expertise. And that has been happening as we speak. We saw it during COVID, for example, with the software, CoWIN, we call it, that was shared with so many developing countries. We shared the technology of making vaccines, although there was a big issue about vaccine technologies. But that is something that we've gone down. But this is something that depends on the country that you're dealing with. But to make it into a mantra or a formula in today's world for development will, I think, not work, because that period, I think, has gone, where there was a top-down approach. We had the Charter of Algiers, G77, New International Economic Order. That served its purpose. It created the awareness. And now with Agenda 2030, we are going bottom-up. We are going country by country, sector by sector, and each country decides. And for example, in India, we have a multiple stakeholder approach, but not all developing countries will have a multiple stakeholder approach. It's for that country to decide. So this coalition is, I think, probably not going to be the way that will take us down this road of development.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Very interesting answer. And I think a very important distinction you made between, for example, what happened in the 70s and 80s and the situation now. I think that's well worth emphasizing. Thank you so much for that. With an eye on the time, which is advancing, I would like to bring in Bai and Abu Bakr again. With this basically with the question, hearing the conversation, following the conversation so far, what is your quick comment, perhaps in terms of things you take away from this conversation, or any things you would like to add? Let me start with Bai. Any reflections from you on where we've taken the conversation so far?
Yes, absolutely. I'll start with Ashok, who was the last speaker, and unfortunately, I'm an engineer, and because of that, we think in terms of systems, things that work. And I do not see AI any different than, let's say, the steam engine in the 19th century. Something that changed the dynamics of, call it human civilization, if you will, progress and whatnot. And because of that, the system's effect in an integrated manner is actually the more potent way to have these things work. He talked about the SDG goals and how countries, individually is the approach. And I'm thinking it's the other way around. As a matter of fact, there's a model I've been working on since 2004. I'm about to really give birth to it. I call it the knowledge engine. And basically what I've done is looked at a lot of programs that are happening around the world, of which SDG is one. I look at societies like the IEEE that develop technologies and on, put them all in one basket and then have an AI bubble wrap around it. And I'm thinking that is the fastest way developing countries, Africa in particular, can leapfrog. But leapfrog, in a manner that's organized, consistent. Essentially, it's a simulation model. So you simulate the dream, if you will, of what a society should look like, should be, and all the linkages, and then you work from that backwards to reality. So that's my thought there. And again, forgive me, I'm an engineer, so we think in terms of, okay, what works and that sort of thing. But that's where I am on that.
Thank you so much. I think a very, very valuable perspective, and very useful also to kind of switch like systems of thought and thinking of how we can approach a problem, because there is the way diplomats do it, which is much more rooted in language and much more accepting of things that are not quite clear, and then building bridges between things that are not quite clear. And as I said, the engineering perspective is very different from that. I think that's exactly where the value lies. So thank you so much for that. Going to Abu Bakr, any final reflections from you on what we've discussed so far? Any final points you want to bring into the discussion?
We have to understand really what is AR. As intelligence, AI is not intelligent in the meaning of human intelligence. AI is just making the jobs faster, and it can deal with enormous big data. So it is not intelligent, but it reflects the effects of the developer and what it finds in the data from anybody's fakes, like something like that. So because the data already used in AI is full with bias. So what happened in the data is reflected in the output algorithm of the AI. So it is a problem. But what we can do is that we use AI with caution. We do not take it what the decision or the thinking of AI for granted. It needs a revision by a human being. And that is why I was stressing on the human ethics, the user himself. He has to take care of the result of the AI. This is one point. The other point, there's a problem of implementation of AI in Africa is enormous. First come investment. This is very important, but Africa can do one thing or one of things. Ask UNDP to be involved for donors of investment, especially from big AI companies like IBM, Microsoft, Google, OpenAI, and so forth, keeping in mind that the era of colonization of Africa by the West cost Africa too much from their wealth and progress. So they have to pay back what they have got from Africa in the 17th century, 18th century, even nowadays. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I do think that a historical perspective and a reflection on the existing power dynamics is very important. So thank you for that comment. Also on the question of how biased is AI. How can we deal with that bias? And then it's up to humans to deal with that. Exactly because we have this conversation today. We're almost out of time. I would like to hand over to Jovan for some final reflections to wrap us up. Yeah, over to you, Jovan.
No, thank you, Kat. Just to remind everybody, this is one of webinar in the series of webinars. I think it's a fourth webinar which we have been running, and there were a few questions about the next step. What I found as extremely relevant and useful are these linkages between local and global. Question of distilled wisdom through proverbs or through storytelling, and including more of that elements in developing of the future AI algorithms, probably giving more weight to those inputs. That was fascinating. And obviously the overall question of governance, where the voices, in particular African voices, should be stronger in the debates on the digital and AI governance. And there are quite a few important moves in that direction. Therefore, we are entering the critical moment of negotiating future social contracts, which are not anymore philosophical. They're very practical. They answer the questions of justice, education, fairness, inclusion. And I would say, based on my experience on discussions which I had recently in San Francisco and other places, there is a real openness to introduce and include different views and perspectives in development of AI. And that would be, at least for me, the key message which echoed in today's discussion, that we have to move both with the philosophical vision of Ubuntu, which was mentioned during discussion, and also very practical steps when it comes to governance and building new AI models.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Johan. Also, thank you to our other speakers. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you with us in this web debate. Ambassador Ashok Mukherjee, Mr. Bai Blyden, and Dr. Abubakar Sultan. Thank you for your perspectives. I think this is a good starting point into a discussion we really need to have, and we will continue to have. We will be back with the next web debate on the first Tuesday next month. So stay with us for more information on that. And as usual, we will follow up with the summary of this debate and some further information just after this debate in an email. So thank you so much. And I think most importantly, let's continue the conversation and see you next month.
Thank you.